Alright.
Okay. Got this. Got that. Put that there. Hell yeah. Alright. Alright. Did my showering, did my chores, did my other stuff, and we're ready to continue reading. Alright, next chapter. The Hallmarks of Cancer. Single quote. I do not wish to achieve immortality through my works. I wish to achieve immortality by not dying. And that's by Woody Allen. Oh, how did that land you? What? 10! The hell? Anyways, scurrying about in its cage in the vivarium atop Harvard Medical School, Philip Leader's oncomouse bore large implications on small haunches. The mouse embodied the maturity of cancer genetics. Scientists had created real living tumors, not just abstract etiolated foci in petri dishes, by artificially manipulating two genes, ROS and MYC, in an animal. Yet Leader's experiment raised further questions about the genesis of cancer. Cancer is not merely a lump in the body. It is a disease that migrates, evolves, invades organs, destroys tissues, and resists to drugs. Activating even two potent proto-oncogenes had not recapitulated the full syndrome of cancer in every cell of the mouse. Cancer genetics had illuminated much about the genesis of cancer, but much evidently remained to be understood. If two oncogenes were insufficient to create cancers, then how many activated proto-oncogenes and inactivated tumor suppressors were required? What were the genetic steps needed to convert a normal cell into a cancer cell? For human cancers, these questions could not be answered experimentally. One could not, after all, proactively create a human cancer and follow the activation and inactivation of genes. But the questions could be answered retrospectively. In 1988, using human specimens, a physician-scientist named Bert Vogelstein at Johns Hopkins Medical School in Baltimore set out to describe the number of genetic changes required to initiate cancer. The query, in various incarnations, would preoccupy Vogelstein for nearly 2 decades. Vogelstein was inspired by the observations made by George Papanicolaou and Oskar Auerbach in the 1950s. Both Papanicolaou and Auerbach, working on different cancers, had noted that cancer did not arise directly out of a normal cell. Instead, cancer often slouched towards its birth, undergoing discrete transitional changes between the fully normal and the frankly malignant cell. Decades before cervical cancer evolved into its fiercely invasive incarnation, whorls of non-invasive pre-malignant cells could be observed in the tissue, beginning their first steps in the grisly march towards cancer. Identifying and eradicating this pre-malignant stage before the cancer spreads is the basis for the Pap smear. Similarly, Auerbach had noted pre-malignant cells were seen in smokers' lungs long before lung cancer appeared. So colon cancer in humans also underwent graded and discrete changes in its progression from a nominal stage from a non-invasive pre-malignant lesion called an adenoma to the highly invasive terminal stage called an invasive carcinoma. Vogelstein chose to study this progression and in colon cancer. He collected samples from patients representing each of the stages of colon cancer. He then assembled a series of 4 human cancer genes, oncogenes, and tumor suppressors, and assessed each state of cancer in the samples for activations and inactivations of these 4 genes. Knowing the heterogeneity of every cancer, one might naively have presumed that every patient's cancer possessed its own sequence of gene mutations and its unique set of mutated genes. But Vogelstein found a strikingly consistent pattern in his colon cancer samples. Across many samples and many patients, the transitions in the stages of cancer were paralleled by the same transitions in genetic changes. cancer cells did not activate or inactivate genes at random. Instead, the shift from a pre-malignant stage to an invasive cancer could precisely be correlated with the activation and inactivation of genes in a strict and stereotypical sequence. In 1988, in the New England Journal of Medicine, Vogelstein wrote, "The four molecular alterations accumulated in a fashion that paralleled the clinical progression of tumors." He proposed, early in the neoplastic process, one colonic cell appears to outgrow its companions to form a small benign neoplasm. During the growth of these cells, a mutation in the ROS gene often occurs. Finally, a loss of tumor suppressor genes may be associated with the progression of adenoma to frank carcinoma. Who the hell is Frank and why is he a carcinoma? I'm kidding. Since Vogelstein had pre-selected his list of 4 genes, he could not enumerate the total number of genes required for the march of cancer. But he had proved an important point, that such a discrete genetic march existed. Papanicolaou and Auerbach had described the pathological transition of cancer as a multi-step process, starting with pre-malignancy and marching inexorably towards invasive cancer. Vogelstein showed that the genetic progression of cancer was also a multi-step process. This was a relief. In the decade between 1980 and 1990, proto-oncogenes and tumor suppressor genes had been discovered in such astonishing numbers in the human genome, at last count about 100 such genes, that their abundance raised a disturbing question. If the genome was so densely littered with such intemperate genes waiting to push a cell towards cancer as if at the flick of a switch, then why was the human body not exploding with cancer every minute? Cancer geneticists already knew 2 answers to the question. First, proto-oncogenes needed to be activated through mutations, and mutations are rare events. Second, tumor suppressor genes needed to be inactivated, but typically 2 copies exist of each tumor suppressor gene, and thus 2 independent mutations are needed to inactivate a tumor suppressor, an even rarer event. Vogelstein provided the third answer. Activating or inactivating any single gene, he postulated, produced only the first steps towards carcinogenesis. Cancer's march was long and slow, and proceeded through many mutations in many genes over many iterations. In genetic terms, our cells were not sitting on the edge of the abyss of cancer. They were dragged towards that abyss in graded, discrete steps. And that's our first break. How are we doing on time? 8 minutes. Wow. Okay. Let's do the ceremonial. Oh, we got a little face reveal of our bell. Here's our bell, guys. And what we do to ring it, we go. Boom. That's great. That's a good ring. Alright. Let's keep going. While Bert Vogelstein was describing the slow march of cancer from one gene mutation to the next, cancer biologists were investigating the functions of these mutations. Cancer gene mutations, they knew, could succinctly be described in 2 categories, either activations of proto-oncogenes or inactivations of tumor suppressor genes. But although dysregulated cell division is the pathological hallmark of cancer, cancer cells do not merely divide. They migrate through the body, destroy other tissues, invade organs, and colonize distant sites. To understand the full syndrome of cancer, biologists would need to link gene mutations in cancer cells to the complex and multifaceted abnormal behavior of these cells. Genes encode proteins, and proteins often work like minuscule molecular switches, activating yet other proteins and inactivating others, turning molecular switches on and off inside a cell. Thus, a conceptual diagram can be drawn for any such protein. Protein A turns B on, which turns C on and D off, which turns E on, and so forth. The molecular cascade is termed the signaling pathway for a protein. Such pathways are constantly active in cells, bringing signals in and signals out, thereby allowing a cell to function in its environment. Proto-oncogenes and tumor suppressor genes, cancer biologists discovered, sit at the hubs of such signaling pathways. ROS, for instance, activates a protein called MEK. MEK, in turn, activates ERK, which, through several intermediary steps, ultimately accelerates cell division. This cascade of steps, called the Ros-Mek-ERK pathway, is tightly regulated in normal cells, thus ensuring tightly regulated cell division. In cancer cells, activated ROS chronically and permanently activates MEK, which permanently activates ERK, resulting in uncontrolled cell division, or pathological mitosis. But the activated ROS pathway does not merely cause accelerated cell division. The pathway also intersects with other pathways to enable several other behaviors of cancer cells. At Children's Hospital in Boston in the 1990s, the surgeon scientist Judah Folkman demonstrated that certain activated signaling pathways within cancer cells, ROS among them, could also induce neighboring blood vessels to grow. A tumor could thus acquire its own blood supply by insidiously inciting a network of blood vessels around itself and then growing in grape-like clusters around these vessels, a phenomenon that Folkman called tumor angiogenesis. Folkman's Harvard colleague Stan Korsmeyer found that other activated pathways in cancer cells, originating in mutated genes, also blocked cell death, thus imbuing cancer cells with the capacity to resist death signals. Other pathways allows cancer cells to acquire motility, the capacity to move from one tissue to another, initiating metastasis. Yet other gene cascades increase cell survival in hostile environments, such that cancer cells traveling through the bloodstream could invade other organs and not be rejected or destroyed in environments not designed for their survival. Cancer, in short, was not merely genetic in its origin. It was genetic in its entirety. Abnormal genes governed all aspects of cancer's behavior. Cascades of aberrant signals, originating in mutant genes, fanned out within the cancer cell, promoting survival, accelerating growth, enabling motility, recruiting blood vessels, enhancing nourishment, drawing oxygen, and sustaining cancer's life. These gene cascades, notably, were perversions of signaling pathways used by the body under normal conditions. The motility genes activated by cancer cells, for instance, are the very genes that normal cells use when they require movement through the body, such as when immunological cells need to move towards sites of infection. Tumor angiogenesis exploits the same pathways that are used when blood vessels are created to heal wounds. Nothing is invented. Nothing is extraneous. Cancer's life is a recapitulation of the body's life, its existence a pathological mirror of our own. Sontag warned against overburdening an illness with metaphors, but this is not a metaphor. Down to their innate molecular core, cancer cells are hyperactive, survival endowed, scrappy, fecund, inventive copies of ourselves. Honestly, if I had cancer, my cancer cells wouldn't be fecund, because 2 times 0 is 0. I am at least socially impotent. Alright, that was another break. So, time for the ritual. Ah, that wasn't good. Fucking hell, that hurt, but that was a good ring. By the early 1990s, cancer biologists could begin to model the genesis of cancer in terms of molecular changes in genes. To understand that model, let us begin with a normal cell, say a lung cell that resides in the left lung of a 40-year-old fire safety equipment installer. One morning in 1968, a minute sliver of asbestos from his equipment wafts through the air and lodges in the vicinity of that cell. His body reacts to the sliver with an inflammation. The cells around the sliver begin to divide furiously, like a minuscule wound trying to heal, and a small clump of cells derived from the original cell arises at the site. In one cell in that clump, an accidental mutation occurs in the ROS gene. The mutation creates an activated version of ROS. The cell containing the mutant gene is driven to grow more swiftly than its neighbors and creates a clump within the original clump of cells. It is not yet a cancer cell, but it is a cell in which uncontrolled cell division has been partially unleashed. A cancer's primordial ancestor. A decade passes. The small collection of Ra's mutant cells continues to proliferate unnoticed in the far periphery of the lung. The man smokes cigarettes, and the carcinogenic chemical in tar reaches the periphery of the lung and collides with the clump of Ra's mutated cells. A cell in this clump acquires a second mutation in its gene, activating a second oncogene. Another decade passes. Yet another cell in that secondary mass of cells is caught in the path of an errant X-ray and acquires yet another mutation, this time inactivating a tumor suppressor gene. This mutation has little effect, since the cell possesses a second copy of that gene. But in the next year, another mutation inactivates the second copy of the tumor suppressor gene, creating a cell that possesses two activated oncogenes and an inactive tumor suppressor gene. Now a fatal marches on, and unraveling begins. The cells, now with 4 mutations, begin to outgrow their brethren. As the cells grow, they acquire additional mutations and they activate pathways, resulting in cells even further adapted for growth and survival. One mutation in a tumor allows it to incite blood vessels to grow. Another mutation within the blood-nourished tumor allows the tumor to survive even in areas of the body with low oxygen. Mutant cells beget mutant cells, a gene that increases the mobility of the cells is activated in the cell. The cell, having acquired motility, can migrate through the lung tissue and enter the bloodstream. A descendant of this mobile cancer cell acquires the capacity to survive in the bone. This cell, having migrated through the blood, reaches the outer edge of the pelvis, where begins yet another cycle of survival, selection, and colonization. It represents the first metastasis of a tumor that originated in the lung. The man is occasionally short of breath. He feels a tingle of pain in the periphery of his lung. Occasionally, he senses something moving under his ribcage when he walks. Another year passes, and the sensations accelerate. The man visits a physician, and a CT scan is performed, revealing a rind-like mass wrapped around the bronchus in the lung. A biopsy reveals lung cancer. A surgeon examines the man and the CT scan of the chest and deems the cancer inoperable. 3 weeks after that visit, the man returns to the medical clinic complaining of pain in his ribs and his hips. A bone scan reveals metastasis to the pelvis and the ribs. Intravenous chemotherapy is initiated. The cells in the lung tumor respond. The man soldiers through a punishing regimen of multiple cell-killing drugs. But during the treatment, one cell in the tumor acquires yet another mutation that makes it resistant to the drug used to treat the cancer. 7 months after his initial diagnosis, the tumor relapses all over the body, in the lung, the bones, and the liver. And on the morning of October 17, 2004, deeply narcotized on opiates in a hospital bed in Boston and surrounded by his wife and children, the man dies of metastatic lung cancer, a sliver of asbestos still lodged in the periphery of his lung. He is 76 years old. I began this as a hypothetical story of cancer. The genes, carcinogens, and the story of mutations in the story is all clearly hypothetical, but the body in the center is real. This man was the first patient to die in my care during my fellowship in cancer medicine at Massachusetts General Hospital. Medicine, I said, begins with storytelling. Patients tell stories to describe illness. Doctors tell stories to understand it. Science tells its own story to explain diseases. This story of one cancer's genesis, of carcinogens causing mutations in internal genes, unleashing cascading pathways in cells that then cycle through mutation, selection, and survival, represents the most cogent outline we have of cancer's birth. And that was the last break. And you know what that means. This hand is my bell striking hand. Oh, wonderful stuff. Okay. In the fall of 1999, Robert Weinberg attended a conference on cancer biology in Hawaii. Late one afternoon, he and Douglas Hanahan, another cancer biologist, trekked through the lava beds of the low black mountains until they found themselves at the mouth of a volcano, staring in. The conversation was tinged with frustration. For too long, it seemed, cancer had been talked about as if it were a bewildering hodgepodge of chaos. The biological characteristics of tumor were described as so multifarious as to defy any credible organization. There seemed to be no organizing rules. Yet, Weinberg and Hanahan knew the discoveries of the prior 2 decades had suggested deep rules and principles. Biologists looking directly into cancer's maw now recognized that rolling beneath the incredible heterogeneity of cancer were behaviors, genes, and pathways. In January 2000, a few months after the walk to the volcano's mouth, Weinberg and Hanahan published an article titled The Hallmarks of Cancer to summarize these rules. It was an ambitious and iconic work that marked the return after nearly a century's detour, the Beauvais' original notion of a unitary cause of carcinoma. We discuss the rules that govern the transformation of normal human cells into malignant cancers. We suggest that research over the past decades has revealed a small number of molecular, biochemical, and cellular traits, acquired capabilities, shared by most and perhaps all types of human cancer. How many rules, then, could Weinberg and Hanahan evoke to explain the core behavior of more than 100 different types and subtypes of tumors? The question was audacious in its expansiveness. The question even more audacious in its economy. The answer more audacious in its economy. 6. We suggest that the vast catalog of cancer cell genotypes is a manifestation of 6 essential alterations in cell physiology that collectively dictate malignant growth. Number 1. Self-sufficiency in growth signals. Cancer cells acquire an autonomous drive to proliferate, pathological mitosis, by virtue of the activation of oncogenes such as RAS or MYC. Insensitivity to growth inhibitory are anti-growth signals. Cancer cells inactivate tumor suppressor genes, such as retinoblastoma or RB, that normally inhibit growth. Number 3. Evasion of programmed cell death or apoptosis. Cell deaths suppress and inactivate genes and pathways that normally enable cells to die. Number 4. Limitless replicative potential. Cancer cells activate specific gene pathways that render them immortal even after generations of growth. Number 5. Sustained angiogenesis. Cancer cells acquire the capacity to draw out their own supply of blood and blood vessels. Tumor angiogenesis. Number 6. Tissue invasion and metastasis. Cancer cells acquire the capacity to migrate to other organs, invade other tissues, and colonize these organs, resulting in their spread throughout the body. Notably, Weinberg and Hanahan wrote, these 6 rules were not abstract descriptions of cancer's behavior. Many of the genes and pathways that enabled each of these 6 behaviors had concretely been identified. RAS, MYC, RB, just to name a few. The task now was to connect this causal understanding of cancer's deep biology to the quest for its cure. Some would argue that the search for the origin and treatment of this disease will continue over the next quarter century in much the same manner as it has in the recent past, by adding further layers of complexity to a scientific literature that is already complex almost beyond measure. But we anticipate otherwise. Those researching the cancer problem will be practicing a dramatically different type of science than we have experienced over the last 25 years. The mechanistic maturity of cancer science would create a new kind of cancer medicine, Weinberg and Hanahan posited. With holistic clarity of mechanism, cancer prognosis and treatment will become a rational science, unrecognizable by current practitioners. Having wandered in the darkness for decades, scientists had finally reached a clearing in their understanding of cancer. Medicine's task was to continue that journey towards a new therapeutic attack. And here is part 6. We finished part 5, we are on to part 6. The fruits of long endeavors. We have 3 quotes to begin this part. First one, we are really reaping the fruits of our long endeavors. What an empty statement. And that is Michael Gorman to Mary Lasker, 1985. Quote 2, the NCI, which has overseen American efforts on researching and combating cancer since 1971, should take on an ambitious new goal for the next decade. The development of new drugs that will provide lifelong cures for many, if not all, major cancers. Beating cancer now is a realistic ambition because, at long last, we largely know its true genetic and chemical characteristics. Damn right we do. Finally, the more perfect a power is, the more difficult it is to quell. And that is by St. Aquinas, attributed. Oh, the second quote. Sorry, I didn't give who the author was for the second quote. That was James Watson in 2009. First chapter is called No One Had Labored in Vain. There's just one quote. Have you met Jimmy? Jimmy is any one of thousands of children with leukemia or any other form of cancer, from the nation or from around the world. And that was from the original pamphlet for the Jimmy Fund in 1963. Oh, what a long time ago. I feel old. I feel really old now. In the summer of 1977, a woman named Phyllis Clausen from Billerica, Massachusetts, posted a letter to the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute. She was writing on behalf of Jimmy, Farber's mascot. It had been nearly 50 years since Jimmy had arrived at Farber's clinic in Boston from upstate Maine with a diagnosis of lymphoma of the intestines. Like all his ward mates from the 1950s, Jimmy was presumed long dead. Not true, Clausen wrote. He was alive and well. Jimmy Einar Gustafsson was a brother, a truck driver in Maine with 3 children. For 5 decades, his family had guarded the knowledge of Jimmy's identity and his survival. Only Sidney Farber had known. Christmas cards from Farber had arrived each winter, until Farber himself had died in 1973. Every year for decades, Clausen and her siblings had sent in modest donations to the Jimmy Fund, divulging to no one that the silhouetted face on the solicitation card for contributions was their brother's. But with the passage of 50 years, Clausen felt she could no longer keep the secret in good conscience. Jimmy's story, she recalled, had become a story that I could not hold. I knew I had to write the letter while Einar was still alive. Clausen's letter was nearly thrown into the trash. Jimmy's sightings, like Elvis sightings, were reported often, but rarely taken seriously. All had turned out to be hoaxes. Doctors had informed the Jimmy Fund's publicity department that the odds of Jimmy's having survived was nil, and that all claims were to be treated with great skepticism. But Clausen's letter contained details that could not be waved away. She wrote of listening to the radio in New Sweden, Maine, in December of 1948 to tune into the Ralph Edwards broadcast. She recalled her brother's midwinter trips to Boston that often took 2 days, with Jimmy in a baseball uniform lying patiently in the back of a truck. When Clausen told her brother about the letter that she had sent, she found him more relieved than annoyed. It was like an unburdening for him too, she recalled. Einar was a modest man. He had kept to himself because he did not want to brag. Clausen's letter was spotted by Karen Cummings, an associate in the Jimmy Fund's development office, who immediately understood its potential significance. She contacted Clausen and then reached Gustafsson. You gotta be really unlucky to have a last name like Cummings. God. Oh, that's the first break. And oh, right, we forgot to sound the new bell for the chapter as well. Oh, what a fool was. We're gonna do 2 bongs for this one. 2 perfect bongs. Oh, that was a good one. That was a really good one. Okay. And another one. Good shit. Okay. Nothing. The bongs were too great. I was mystified. A few weeks later, in January 1998, Cummings arrived to meet Jimmy at a truck stop outside a shopping center in a suburb of Boston. It was 6 in the morning in a bone-chilling winter day, and Gustafson and his wife piled into Cummings' warm car. Cummings had brought a tape of Jimmy from 1948 singing his favorite song. She played it. And, take me out to the ball game, take me out with the crowd, buy me some peanuts and Cracker Jack. I don't care if I never get back. Gustafson listened to his own voice with tears in his eyes. Cummings and Jimmy's wife sat in the car, their eyes also welling with silent tears. Later that month, Cummings drove up to New Sweeting, a brutally beautiful town in northern Maine with austere angular houses set against an even more austere landscape. Old-timers in the town also recalled Gustafson's trips to Boston for chemotherapy. He had hitchhiked to and from Boston in cars and trucks and delivery vans anytime someone from the town had driven up or down the coast. It had taken a village to save a child. As Cummings sat in Gustafson's kitchen, he crept upstairs and returned with a cardboard box. Wrapped inside was the battered baseball uniform that the Boston Braves had given Jimmy on the night of the Edwards broadcast. Cummings needed no further proof. And so it was in May 1998, almost exactly 50 years after he had journeyed from small-town Maine to the Children's Hospital to meet the odd formal doctor in a 3-piece suit, that Jimmy returned with full fanfare to the Jimmy Fund. His wardmates from the hospital, the Sandler twin with his recalcitrant leukemia engorging his spleen, the blonde girl in plates by the television, little Jenny with leukemia, had long ago been buried in small graves in and around Boston. Gustafson walked into the Jimmy Fund building, up the low, long steps to the room where the clockwork train had run through the mountain tunnel. Patients, survivors, nurses, and doctors milled around him. Like a latter-day Rip Van Winkle, he found the present unfathomable and unrecognizable. Everything has changed, Clausen recalled him saying. The rooms, the patients, the drugs. But more than anything, survivorship had changed. I now remember the cancer ward as a place with many curtains, he continued. When the children were well, the curtains would be spread open, but they would soon close the curtains, and there would be no child when they were opened again. Hugh Gustafson was, 50 years later, back in those long hallways with the faded cartoon pages on the walls, his curtains thrown apart. It is impossible to know whether Jimmy had... Why do I keep on saying Jiminy? It is impossible to know whether Jimmy had survived based on surgery or chemotherapy, or because his cancer had been inherently benign in its behavior. But the facts of his medical history are irrelevant. His return was symbolic. Jimmy had unwittingly been picked to become the icon of a child with cancer. But Einar Gustafson, now 63-year-old, had returned as the icon of a man beyond cancer. How we doing? 34 minutes? Cool. Okay, that was a break, by the way. Let's do this day. Oh, wonderful shits. Alright, let's do this. The Italian memoirist Primo Levi. I'm sorry, my voice went a bit quiet there. who survived a concentration camp and then navigated his way through a blasted Germany to his native Turin, often remarked that among the most fatal qualities of the camp was its ability to erase the idea of a life outside and beyond itself. A person's past and his present were annihilated as a matter of course. To be in the camps was to abnegate history, identity, and personality, but it was also the erasure of the future that was the most chilling. With the annihilation, Levy wrote, came a moral and spiritual death that perpetuated the status quo of imprisonment. If no life existed beyond the camp, then the distorted logic by which the camp operated became life as usual. Cancer is not a concentration camp, but it shares the quality of annihilation. It negates the possibility of life outside and beyond itself. It subsumes all living. The daily life of a patient becomes so intensely preoccupied with his or her illness that the world fades away. Every last morsel of energy is spent tending the disease. How to overcome him became my obsession, the journalist Max Lerner wrote of the lymphoma in his spleen. If it was to be a combat, then I had to engage it with everything I had, knowledge and guile, ways covert as well as overt. For Carla, in the midst of the worst phase of her chemotherapy, the day-to-day rituals of survival utterly blotted out any other thought of survivorship in the long run. When I asked a woman with a rare form of muscle sarcoma about her life outside the hospital, she told me that she spent her days and nights scouring the internet for news about the disease. I'm in the hospital, she said, even when I am outside the hospital. The poet Jason Schinder wrote, cancer is a tremendous opportunity to have your face pressed right up against the glass of your mortality. But what patients see through the glass is not a world outside cancer, but a world taken over by it. Cancer reflected endlessly around them like a hall of mirrors. I was not immune to this compulsive preoccupation either. In the summer of 2005, as my fellowship hurtled to its end, I experienced perhaps a singularly transformative event of my life, the birth of my daughter. Yeah, this is me talking. I birthed a daughter. I'm kidding, I didn't. It's the author. Congratulations to Mr. Mukherjee. Is the male guy? I keep on assuming he's a male guy, but I doubt I've had much. Never mind. I'm rambling. Okay. Glowing, beautiful, and cherubic, Leela was born on a warm night in the Massachusetts General Hospital, then swaddled in blankets and brought to the newborn unit in the 14th floor. The unit is directly across from the cancer ward. I would like to see myself at my wife's side, awaiting the miraculous moment of my daughter's birth as most fathers do. But in truth, I was gowned and gloved like a surgeon, with a blue sterile sheet spread out in front of me, and a long syringe in my hands, poised to harvest a maroon gush of blood cells from the umbilical cord. When I cut that cord, part of me was the father, but the other part an oncologist. Umbilical blood contains one of the richest known sources of blood-forming stem cells that can be stored away in cryobanks and used as a bone marrow transplant to treat leukemia in the future, an intensely precious resource often flushed down the sink in hospitals after childbirth. The midwives rolled their eyes. The obstetrician, an old friend, asked jokingly if I'd ever stopped thinking about work, but I was far too steeped in the study of blood to ignore my instincts. In the bone marrow transplant rooms across that very hallway were patients for whom I had scoured tissue banks across the nation for 1 or 2 pints of these stem cells that might save their lives. Even in this most life-affirming of moments, the shadows of malignancy and death were forever lurking on my psyche. That's a wonderful thing. I wish I had a baby. Sounds as though I want to get pregnant, but that's quite impossible. So wait, hospitals just throw this away even though it's very valuable? What the hell? What the hell? Oh, right, it's a break. Hell yeah. How we doing? 40 minutes. Good job. But not everything was involuting into death. Something transformative was also happening in the Fellows Clinic in the summer of 2005. Many of my patients, whose faces had so fixedly been pressed up against the glass of their mortality, began to glimpse an afterlife beyond cancer. February, as I said before, had marked the midpoint of an abysmal descent. Cancer had reached its full lethal bloom that month. Nearly every week had brought news of a more mounting toll, culminating chillingly with Steve Harmon's arrival in the emergency room and his devastating spiral into death thereafter. Some days I dreaded walking by the fax machines outside my office, where a pile of death certificates would be awaiting for my signature. But then, like a poisonous tide receding, the bad news ebbed. The nightly phone calls from the hospitals or from ERs and hospice units around Boston, bringing news of yet another death, suddenly ceased. It was as if the veil of death had lifted, and survivors had emerged from underneath. I need to change my position. Ben Orman had been definitively cured of Hodgkin's lymphoma. It had not been an effortless voyage. His blood counts had dropped calamitously during the mid-cycle of chemotherapy. For a few weeks it had appeared that the lymphoma had ceased responding, a poor prognostic sign portending a therapy-resistant fatal variant of the disease. But in the end, the mass in his neck and the larger archipelago of masses in his chest had all melted away, leaving just minor remnants of scar tissue. The formality in his demeanor had visibly relaxed. When I last saw him in the summer of 2005, he spoke about moving away from Boston to Los Angeles to join a law firm. He assured me that he would visit to follow up, but I wasn't convinced. Orman epitomized the afterlife of cancer, eager to forget the clinic and its bleak rituals, like a bad trip to a foreign country. Catherine Fitz could also see a life beyond cancer. For Fitz, when the lung tumor wrapped ominously around her bronchus, the biggest hurdle had been the local control of her cancer. The mass had been excised in an incredibly meticulous surgery. She had then finished adjuvant chemotherapy and radiation. Nearly 12 months after the surgery, there was no sign of a local relapse, nor was there any sign of the woman who had come to the clinic several months earlier, nearly folded over in fear. Tumor out, chemotherapy done, radiation behind her, Fitz's effervescence poured out of every spigot of her soul. At times, watching her personality emerge as if through a nozzle, it seemed abundantly clear why the Greeks had thought of disease as pathological blockades of humors. Carla returned to me in July 2005, bringing pictures of her 3 growing children. She refused to let another doctor perform her bone marrow biopsy, so I walked over from the lab on a warm morning to perform the procedure. She looked relieved when she saw me, greeting me with her anxious half-smile. We had developed a ritualistic relationship. Who was I to desecrate a lucky ritual? The biopsy revealed no leukemia in the bone marrow. Her remission for now was still intact. I have chosen these cases not because they were miraculous, but because of precisely the opposite reason. They represent a routine spectrum of survivors. Hodgkin's disease cured with multi-drug chemotherapy, locally advanced lung cancer controlled with surgery, chemotherapy, and radiation, lymphoblastic leukemia in a prolonged remission after intensive chemotherapy. To me, these were miracles enough. It is an old complaint about the practice of medicine that it inures you to the idea of death, but when medicine inures you to the idea of life, to survival, then it has failed utterly. The novelist Thomas Wolfe, recalling a lifelong struggle with illness, wrote in his last letter, "I made a long voyage and been in a strange country, and I have seen the dark man very close. I had not made the journey myself, and I had only seen the darkness reflected in the eyes of others, but surely it was the most